Today we have Stephanie Malin here from the Department of Sociology to talk about food, energy, water system issues and especially how that relates to oil and gas industry. We've had 3 engineers so far, so I think it'll be nice to get the perspective of a social scientist today and kind of change the direction of some of our conversations. So welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here on a Friday. I appreciate it. So I'm in the Department of Sociology, a civil side. I'm also with the Colorado School of Public Health here. I'm an adjunct associate professor with them. Work at the Water Center with the School for Global Environmental Sustainability, and I help run the Environmental Justice Working Group that we're hoping becomes a Center for Environmental Justice next year. So I try to be as interdisciplinary as possible. So even though I am a sociologist, I'm learning a lot from engineers that I'm working with and others, public health researchers. So hopefully we'll have some good interdisciplinary ideas here. But just so that you are feeling, we'll get the little slideshow going here. Hold on one second, bear with me. Okay, there we go. So that you know what I do, what an environmental sociologist does, I just wanted to give a little sense of the kinds of research we're doing, the kinds of questions we're asking, why these are relevant to this InTERFEWS program. So as an environmental sociologist, I look at the ways in which our social systems, especially our political and economic systems, interact with the biophysical environment. So what does our social organization look like? How do our political and economic systems rely on, but also put goods and bads into the environment? So what are we looking at also from an environmental justice perspective, right? How do we distribute those goods and bads throughout society? Goods would be things that we enjoy a lot in a place like Fort Collins, right? So public transportation, beautiful vistas, bike paths, really conducive to having a good life in your environment. And bads are the industrial contaminants that we've created, as well as other kinds of waste and risky environmental hazards. And we also look at the procedural aspects of this, right? And I'll get into this a bit more in the context of EJ, but who decides where we put these things that are good and bad? How do we zone? How do we enforce regulations? And what does this mean for sustainability? And in my research, and a lot of sociologists, what we end up looking at are institutions in society, right? Because institutions in society are the organizations that we create to structure and formalize these relationships with our environment and across the social world, right? So institutions are a really important unit of analysis for a sociologist who's trying to look at kind of these nexus spaces, right, where a lot of different economic sectors come together or social groups meet, and those institutions are really the arbiters of that. So is that clear to everybody, what I'm doing as a sociologist? Okay, cool. So in Colorado, right, which is where I'm going to talk about 2 specific research studies that I've done today related to oil and gas and environmental justice at the FEWS Nexus. But I want to just give us a little context on why I'm looking at this in Colorado. So I've done a lot of work in the West on uranium extraction, uranium mining and milling since about 2006 when I was just a baby master's student. And Colorado has a very similar historical and economic context to Utah, as well as many other Western states. We have been an epicenter of energy production and extractive activity for over 100 years now. We have been an epicenter of milling and mining for a variety of natural resources, from uranium to coal, and as we're all very aware, right, we've had multiple booms and busts in oil and gas throughout Colorado's recent history. We are also a place that is targeted a lot of times, especially in rural areas, for waste storage. But we're also dealing with scarce water, right? So unlike some of these other epicenters of production in places like the Southeast or the Northeast or the Midwest, we're also dealing with that extra added pressure or variable of being in a semi-arid region, right? So having scarce water as we're trying to do things like extract and produce energy, which are often, as many of you know, right, really water-intensive processes. And we're seeing new development in sectors like oil and gas that, as I said, Colorado's had historical relationships with, right? But now what we're seeing is the spread to areas that we haven't seen before. So it's coming up against peri-urban areas or urban areas. This is why we're seeing well pads in the middle of residential areas in Colorado, right, as the population booms and different economic sectors also boom. And importantly for the FEWS nexus, right, we're also seeing a lot of overlap. This has been historical, but it's increasing. The overlap of farmland that's being used as sites of energy production. So especially with oil and gas production, where these operators need access to enough land to set up well paths and pipelines and infrastructure, there's a strong relationship with agricultural actors, especially farmers and ranchers, both in Colorado and in places like Pennsylvania. If you're interested in that, I have an article that came out in Journal of Rural Studies in 2016 that looks at those kind of intersecting natural resource dependencies for farmers, right, who depend on these really unstable global commodity markets for agricultural commodities, but also are now stuck in a situation where they're getting royalties or bonuses from oil and gas production on their land. And having that be fairly unstable, and the natural gas market has had some interesting price fluctuations and things like that. So that's kind of the theoretical and on the ground context for this FEWS nexus, right, and the historical aspects of it. So in terms of environmental justice, there are a few elements of environmental justice. The ones I focus on for my research here, and which I'll explain and really focus on today, have to do with how we distribute those goods I was talking about, right? Where are the toxins and hazards? Who's exposed to them? As well as procedural justice. Who decides how we zone, how we use land, how we use water, and very importantly, who has a seat at the table to make meaningful decisions and influence policy in a meaningful way, right? Not just a 3-minute public comment period that no one really does anything with, but actually being able to have some power and influence in a scenario where you can influence the policy outcome or whatever decision is being made. And there are hundreds of studies produced by sociologists, urban planners, anthropologists, public health researchers, epidemiologists, who show, at least in terms of distributive injustice, that we have a very strong pattern in the United States, but also globally, of communities of color, low-income communities, and more marginalized communities being the ones who are victims of this distributive injustice, right? So the ones who are exposed to toxins and hazards in the environment first, because they're typically the communities or the groups that have the least power and fewest resources to combat being chosen as the site for a waste incinerator or a mine or a mill, for example. So there are those elements of justice that really play into how we develop our energy systems, how we use water, how we think about our food systems, and the scale of all these things and how accessible they are to ongoing policy conversations about sustainability and environmental justice. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So just to give us a context, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. How many of you want like a little primer on what hydraulic fracturing looks like and what we're talking about when we talk about unconventional drilling? Who's comfortable with that? I asked 2 different questions. I'm trying to confuse you. Who would like a primer? I'll go with my first question.
Do it because we're recording.
Oh, okay, cool. I forget we're recording. All right, so this is a really fun cartoony drawing of what's going on. For all you engineers, you're probably cringing, like, oh God, but we'll ignore that. So what's unconventional about drilling right now is not the technology that's being used. This has been around for 60 or 70 years, this combination of vertical and horizontal drilling. What's unconventional is the scale and the pace at which this is happening, and the distances that we can go with the horizontal drilling. So I'll start out with a brief explanation of the technical, and then talk about the policy aspect of this that has really allowed that pace and scale to take off. So when we look at, we've got a variety of shale plays in the United States. This is a map just showing us those different plays. What that means is just areas where we have shale, a layer of shale rock, which is what's right here, right? Where we can develop enough that we can pull out little bits of oil and natural gas that are embedded in that shale rock. Now, the development has been extensive because there are shale plays in over 15 states. So we're seeing this boom happen since about the mid-2000s in over 15 states, including especially Colorado, along the Denver-Julesburg Basin. It's called the Niobrara Shale region. That's where we are. There's also the Pissant Basin, though, on the western slope and into other states that has more natural gas. So we're extracting mostly oil here, and mostly natural gas is being extracted on the western side of the state. Other areas like, you've probably heard of the Barnett Shale, the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas, the Bakken region in North Dakota, those are also producing oil. And then there's a variety, including the Marcellus Shale, which is an enormous natural gas deposit in their shale layer. Natural gas is also being extracted, and of course, is part of the production process for oil as well. So this is a technology that's been used across the U.S., a set of technologies, I should say. And what it's doing is moving us beyond kind of the jelly donut conventional model of drilling, where you just have your vertical drill and you go down into this nice deposit or reserve of oil or natural gas and you're able to extract it. Instead, it's more like, and I'm stealing a guy that I give presentations with from Boulder uses this analogy, so I'm stealing his analogy. But we're not now in kind of the tiramisu model, right? We're not in the jelly donut model anymore. We have to get down to a layer of shale and we have to drill horizontally through that layer to get to those tiny little deposits because we're out of, we can't access anymore, right, the really accessible deposits that we've used up. So we vertically drill through the water table down. In Colorado, it's about 7,000 or 8,000 feet. This varies drastically from one location to the next, given the depth of the water table as well as the shale layer. Once that layer is reached, the vertical drilling stops. There's cement casing that has been put in the whole way through because obviously want to minimize leaks into the water table as well as accidents or leaks the rest of the way. And then once we reach the shale layer at the appropriate depth, that's when the directional or horizontal drilling starts. And that currently you can have at least 16 drills going out in multiple directions from that one well pad. And the number keeps increasing, as well as the distance that horizontal drill can go. Now it can go up to about 4 miles, and that's always increasing. So once that horizontal drill is extended as far as they want, then small explosions are set off along the pipe. That creates these little fissures. The sand or the ceramic, whatever material is in the fracking fluid, for that particular batch of fracking fluid, ends up, as it's pressured down, you have about 3 to 5 million gallons of potable water every time that are used for each frac. That is pressured at very high speeds so that it can get all the way through that 3 or 4 miles of horizontal pipe. And it's meant to break open those fissures even more, embed those bits of ceramic or sand in there to keep those fissures open, and then the water, most of it, comes back out through. And that's when you can get your oil or your gas extraction going. So does that make sense to everybody for the basics of the process? Now, an issue with this, right, is that you can have a well pad on the surface and you can drill under somebody's home, for example, because you can go 3 or 4 miles. So I'll get to that and some of the tensions that are related to this. I just wanted us to be aware of the process. This was called environmentally friendly drilling right back in 2006, 2007 when I first started researching it as a grad student at Utah State. This was going on in Vernal and other places in Utah that have a history of oil and gas development. And natural gas is very much framed as this kind of miracle bridge fuel, right? So the public discourse, the scientific discourse on this practice has changed quite a bit in the last decade. I also want to mention, like I said, what makes this unconventional is the policy context. In 2005, the Energy Policy Act essentially took these technologies called the Halliburton loophole, and if you remember, Vice President Dick Cheney, Ken Lay from Enron, several others who had deep connections with the energy industry were facilitating that Energy Policy Act process, and possibly as a result, unconventional oil and gas operators as well as nuclear operators were exempted from 7 out of 15 environmental regulations for those processes. What it meant was the oil and gas industry, which was already exempted from very key parts of federal legislation like NEPA, having to do environmental impact statements at all federal sites, for example, or on all projects, things like the CERCLA Act, many of our environmental acts, they were already exempt from components of those. But what that re-regulation did in 2005 through the Energy Policy Act was allow them to not have to get permits under the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, and a host of other federal regulations, right? So it allowed the pace and the scale of development to explode, right? We could utilize these technologies that had existed for decades much quicker because it wasn't up to the federal government anymore to say this won't harm drinking water or clean water, right? It was up to individual states to figure out how to permit and zone and regulate this activity. And most states don't still have regulations for unconventional drilling. They have regulations for conventional drilling, but not for this kind of unconventional drilling. And the scale at which it's exploded, but particularly the pace at which it's happening, has really not allowed states to keep up, right? So the production has sped ahead. The social, political, and regulatory responses have really not caught up even in a place like Colorado that touts itself as having the best regulations or the most stringent regulations in the United States. Does that context make sense to everybody? Okay. So I mentioned this, right? These are two photos I've taken from one on the left from Colorado, just out in Weld County, and this is from Bradford County and in northern Pennsylvania, where I've also done field work on farmland and oil and gas and the links between the two. Just showing that in these states where we've seen these booms and busts in oil and gas production, farmland is that necessary kind of that zone of land that these industries need to access to just have the space they need to run all of, not just the well pads, but to run pipelines and have all the infrastructure so that we can export those goods, right, or get them from one place to the next. And so it's not just peri-urban areas, right? That's something new, coming in contact with residential areas and schools, but it's also these more rural and agricultural areas that are really being impacted by this development, with well pads springing up or tank batteries and compressor stations and other bits of infrastructure, and sometimes right next to people's homes or in amongst their where they're grazing their livestock or raising crops, for example. I wanted to give us a sense of what drilling looks like in Colorado because the two projects I'll be talking about are based here. We have some of the most prolific drilling going on in the United States. All these blue dots are permits that have been granted by the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It's our one regulatory body over oil and gas in the state, and they do all the permitting. They have never yet denied a permit. That may change now with the new Senate bill that was just signed into law, hopefully. But as of yet, no permits have been denied. All of these dots show us that we have 52,000 wells operating in the state. About 21,000 of them alone are in Weld County. So that's why you can't even really see Weld County right here. It's very covered in oil and gas production, very supportive of that, has a long history of that. But it's also a top 10 agricultural production county in the US. So it's number 6 most recently in the volume of agricultural production going on. And it's also the county with the most oil and gas wells in the nation, right? So you have industrial agriculture, really high production going on in that, as well as now this very industrial system of oil and gas extraction, really located right here in Weld County. Over on the western slope, this is mostly natural gas production going on, and that's had its own history of contention, mostly because a lot of those lands are BLM or federal lands, and so across Colorado we run into this split estate issue, right, where most of us, even if you own your home, we don't own the minerals under the surface. An oil and gas company, probably a railroad, sometimes another operator, sometimes the federal government, right? There's a suite of firms or institutions that own that land, but it's very rarely the person living above the land, right? So you can control a bit what goes on the surface. You have no ability to control what goes on under the surface. And so especially when you're dealing with that on these lands where you're grazing cattle, on BLM land, for example, you can have a well show up or other infrastructure show up in your yard. I have no say over that, right? There's a really good film called Split Estate that focuses on rifle and other areas that deal with this if you're interested in that. So we've ended up with a host of social outcomes, no surprise, as a result of this activity really bumping up against communities and being on land that we use for growing food, as well as the amount of water that it uses. So I'll talk to you today about 2 projects that I looked at. I'll be as brief as I can. But some of the big patterns that are developing here in terms of environmental justice, right, and thinking about how do we decide the best way to do these operations? Are they even sustainable when we talk about things like the carbon budget, right? We end up with really divided communities. So you have communities where there's really stark contrast between who's benefiting and who's paying the cost. Benefits tend to accrue to a very small number of operators and landowners. It's a case of privatization of profit and socialization or nationalization of risk. So the public is dealing with some of these externalized risks, right? Things like possible impacts to air quality, air pollution. For example, Denver is the 10th worst air quality in terms of ozone. Fort Collins is 15th worst. And we can link that back to commuting traffic and transportation, but the second highest cause of that is oil and gas operations. And if we think about the number of diesel trucks that are on the road to truck water around and service this industry, one could say that that uptick in transportation, the first driver is also directly related to oil and gas operations. So these costs are unevenly distributed. There are land use conflicts, particularly between surface owners and mineral rights holders. Our state Supreme Court has added to this contested governance, like who's in charge, who gets to decide where these well pads show up. In a state where we have home rule, right, where state municipalities have said, we want to decide what goes on within our borders. If you want to open up a pot dispensary, we want to be able to say yes or no, right? But this is the one industry that gets to be exempt from those home rule rights that communities have voted for. So we have very little clarity in terms of who decides where things end up, who has the rights to do this, who has the responsibility to take care of problems that result. And we just had a bill passed in the state legislature, as I mentioned, that Governor Polis signed that's now demanding, right, that companies and the industry actually need to, and our state regulator, the COGCC, actually needs to pay attention to things like public health and environmental well-being when permitting. But we have yet to see if that will actually make a difference and if any permits will be denied now, given that there haven't been any. But right now, our state Supreme Court, as of 2016, has said, no local community or group has the right to zone this activity. It's illegal because it's seen as a taking of the wealth of those minerals, right? So you're blocking the access of mineral rights holders or owners to develop their wealth. And so if you're doing that, if you're blocking that by having a local ordinance, or like Fort Collins voted for a moratorium and it's been overturned by this decision because that was seen as taking, right? So this is kind of the political and social context that we end up in here, with supporters really looking at jobs and economic development. When we think about the Proposition 112 debates, where the industry spent about $30 million to convince us that their jobs were worth it, as well as U.S. energy independence, and then opponents saying they have these bigger concerns about environmental justice issues, environmental health, and economic issues, right? So we saw in 2015, when the industry busts, it sheds workers, right? We're not providing jobs for the long term, even though they're often well-paying jobs. They last about 3 to 5 years and are often populated by transient workers who've been in the oil fields in Texas or North Dakota or Pennsylvania. They end up here, right? These jobs are often either require really high skill sets, so you're a petroleum engineer or you're a geologist, or you're working in the oil fields and you're often been brought in from another location. So there are quite a few debates or threads to this debate. The first project, I have no idea what time it is because we don't have a little clock down there. Oh, thank you. I'll just keep turning around. We want to leave about 10 minutes for questions, or five. Okay, cool. Good. 5 will be more realistic. Would be great, but 5. Okay. I'm going to put these down because I don't even know really why I have them. So the first project I'll talk to you about, very Colorado-based. It was funded by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, which is an arm of the National Institutes of Health. And we were funded, it's a team of researchers. I was a social scientist leading that part of the study. And then we also had epidemiologists and exposure scientists from the Anschutz Medical Campus and from up here working on this study as well. Because when we got this grant in 2014, what we were all seeing in our research, my research looking at farmland that had well pads on it and what was happening with that, as well as John Adgate and Lisa McKenzie, my 2 collaborators on this, they're very well published in this area, showing a lot of public health risks, including impacts like increased birth defect rates, increased childhood leukemia rates, if you look at our state rates for those diseases, and people's proximity to well pads. So with all of this evidence that was emerging about public health impacts, we're also hearing a lot of evidence from people that living near these sites was really stressful, that they were having huge impacts to quality of life, and that the whole scenario was just increasing their stress, even if a well pad wasn't yet sited, which was pretty fascinating to me, right? So it could just be like, you're talking about 22 well pads that might go into the middle of your neighborhood, and that conversation, that possibility is enough to drive a lot of tension and division within the community and create a lot of stress. So we wanted to systematically measure this, right? We wanted to see, okay, well, we can measure other aspects of health, that quality of life and stress seem to be these really chronic things that were developing and being reported as we would talk to people or survey people. And it was something that wasn't, it didn't matter what somebody's political affiliation was. It didn't matter, for example, if they had well pads on their land, they loved the industry, they were getting royalties, they were benefiting in a lot of ways. These concerns were emerging across these groups, right? So it seems really important to dig into that. And so NIEHS funded us for what was a 2-year study. And I should mention, a lot of other medical schools, public health schools, including Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, many others have been releasing studies that have shown similar impact, right? So we're just getting this accumulating data, even while we've been working on this grant, that's showing this weight of evidence that there are some public health issues as well as environmental justice issues. So we formalized that question looking at kind of this nexus between environmental health and justice, community well-being or community tensions in daily life. When people are sitting at this nexus of living in a place that's got a lot of food production, we're very aware of water scarcity, and we have this booming energy sector. So what are the environmental risks and uncertainties that intersect with rapid changes to people's communities and how we're using land, right? And as a result, people's daily lives. A lot of people are moving into Colorado from out of state, right? A lot of retirees. And this was a picture I took in Windsor, just off of as people are looking out from their homes, right, over Windsor, they're seeing a lot of oil and gas infrastructure, as well as the brown haze that everyone talks about, which isn't just because of oil and gas, but this is fundamentally shifting people's quality of life who are moving in, as well as especially folks who lived here for a long period of time. So this was a 3-year study, a multi-community mixed method study. We looked at Greeley, which has a history of and a high concentration of drilling, like you saw. Windsor, which is a newer site of drilling and is split between Weld and Larimer counties, and Fort Collins, which at the time was our control because until we were sued and the Supreme Court overturned our voters' decisions about what we wanted to do within city limits, Fort Collins didn't have drilling going on and was kind of the control community. So we did surveys across these communities, randomly sampled a stratified sample of households from all of these communities, again with Fort Collins being our control. We've done in-depth interviews. I've done over 80 in-depth interviews on quality of life and stress so far, and the project is ongoing. Even though we got a no-cost extension and moved into the 3rd year, I'm still conducting interviews now that that's over because so many people want to participate in this project and tell their stories about what's going on. We also had, as part of the epidemiology and exposure part of this, we were taking biomarkers for stress. We were taking cheek swabs, hair samples, blood samples to look at things like cortisol levels. We haven't been able to afford to analyze this yet, but also looking at telomere length. So seeing if exposure to chronic stress was shortening people's telomeres. And we had 3 sites set up where we vetted volunteers who came in. They had to pass a bunch of criteria in terms of their behavioral and health habits and things like that so that we could say with confidence that these biomarkers of stress were related to that and not related to things like cigarette smoking or other risks that they were encountering. Did you?
I was just going to ask, but you kind of answered it. So you had actual quantitative measurements of indicators of stress that dealt with physiology.
Yes, and then combining it with the surveys and the qualitative evidence about people's narratives of how they're experiencing stress. Mm-hmm. So those two combined. We have an article that should be out very soon that we've been working on forever, combining these two kinds of data. So as soon as I know about that, I can share it with, or as soon as it's out, I'll share that with the group. Yeah, but it was really exciting to be able to have those 2 different ways of looking at this, and I think that's why NIEHS thought it was through their R21 grant too that wants you to look at what's going on the ground and kind of get there quickly and set up a study. So, but that was really, really cool to kind of see those, or not, I guess, from a not from a quality of life perspective, but from a researcher perspective, it's like, wow, you can actually see these things correlating really convincingly. So from the sociological portion of the study, the major findings are that the institutional and structural context of regulating UOG is just unconventional oil and gas production, regulating that kind of production in Colorado are contributing to a diminished quality of life, increased stress, and this is especially true for people who are living near development or living near a place that might be the site of future development. We also notice this emerging most for people who've lived here the longest because they're seeing fundamental changes to their environment, including air quality, but then also the tension that this new development is bringing into their communities. So there are 2 major mechanisms that are driving the lack of, or the reduced quality of life and increased stress. One is uncertainty, right? The fact that people don't know what the hell is going on in this industry across the board. We don't yet know what the public health impacts are. Part of the point of moratoria, right, was to have about 5 years for some of these air quality studies that Detlef and other folks are doing down in Boulder. to get results from these things, right? So to get results from our studies, we could understand what are the nature of the risks, right? And we have some data that matches the pace of industry development. But we haven't done that. And so there's a variety of uncertainties that people face in their daily lives as a result of oil and gas. First, what are the economic impacts? So again, we're looking at boom bust prone industries. A lot of folks who thought this was more stable had family members or lost their own jobs in 2015 when the industry was busting. What are the health impacts, right? We're just learning that there are some public health risks. We don't yet know a lot about them though. But wanting to be precautious, right? People are worried about those getting out of the gate before we have a chance to understand them and maybe mitigate those impacts. What are safety concerns, right? Especially after that explosion in Firestone. And that's not caused by current development, it's caused by unmonitored and abandoned former development, but we have to be cognizant that we're intersecting with and interacting with that across the Denver-Julesburg Basin. So people are uncertain about all these things. They're uncertain about how we can best interact with and influence the institutions that are in charge of governing this industry. There's not a lot of trust in those institutions because there's not a good record of those institutions listening to members of the public. And most importantly, people just don't know how to assess risk, right? Given the lack of information and the abundance of uncertainty, people don't know how to ascertain information about how to figure out what they need to do and how to protect their kids, how to protect their own health. And this really impacts their daily lives. On top of that, right, we know that re-injecting fracking fluid creates increased or induced seismicity, right? We've seen this in Oklahoma, we're seeing this in Colorado. So on top of this, people are really worried that now that we're re-injecting produced water more in Colorado, and especially along I-25, that they're also going to see damage to their property, right? Not only worried about losing property value if they're near a well or if people want to move here because of this industry, but because their foundations may be affected, their most valuable, biggest investment can end up being really at risk. Powerlessness is the second mechanism that is really driving decreased quality of life and increased stress levels for people, because even if they did know what to do, right, even if there was certainty about risk, and there's increasing certainty about public health risk at least, people don't have a seat at the table to influence policy about this issue. So they feel powerless to actually enact some of our rules like home rule control. They are unsure how to realize that element of procedural equity, right, which says we have a seat at the table, we have a meaningful opportunity to participate as stakeholders or members of the public who are breathing this air, right, who are buying homes, who are affected by these things. And there's little trust in multiple institutions. The Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, I keep mentioning, right, that permitting body, not a lot of trust that they will actually listen given that record. Not a lot of trust in our Department of Public Health, which when Lisa McKenzie, for example, publishes her findings that are based on cancer registry data from that agency, the director of the agency will write an op-ed in the Denver Post that will denigrate her findings, right? And will say there's no public health risk. So the behavior of our state institutions, including our state Supreme Court, has been really mystifying to people, right? If they're there to protect the public good and maybe protect resources for future generations under the concept of public trust, that's not happening. Right, and so there's little trust in a lot of these institutions. So just to give you a sense of what we're hearing from interviews, right, this is a representative quotation of these increased levels of stress. This is from a woman who lives in Windsor who is organizing a community to try to move a site to another neighborhood. That's one of the few mechanisms of control we have in Colorado right now. You can identify an alternative site for these well pads to go into, which has created NIMBYism, right? Again, all over again. We don't want this in our backyard. We'll move it over to Bella Romero, right, where they don't have as much power to counter these sites. We'll move it to a poorer neighborhood, right? Triple Creek, for example. And so this is what the alternatives people have, right? To push it on others or to deal with it in their neighborhood. And this Windsor woman says, I have to tell you, I live in Windsor right by the Pace property. This is the property that ended up getting moved over to Bella. And my stress levels are through the roof. My life has not been the same since I got involved. I've not slept through the night, and I don't know how long. And again, this isn't even with an operating set of well pads, which leads to a whole other set of factors diminishing people's quality of life, like having sound walls right outside your home, or trying to sleep and hearing very, very deep vibrations, right, and not being able to really ever get a good night's sleep. Things like that are emerging. In the interest of time, I'm going to whip through some of these so I can just preview the water study as well. We're also finding a lot of evidence of community tensions and social structures, divides that develop within communities and between communities as we debate these sites. As well as evidence that the industry has a lot of meta power, meaning they get to really set the rules of the game, right? They're influencing legislation, and they are also heavily influencing regulatory bodies in places like Colorado, but also in Pennsylvania and Texas and North Dakota. I have an article that just came out on that in Social Forces. It's a top-rated sociology journal that where we're looking at data in Colorado and Pennsylvania from over 100 interviews that are showing evidence of industry meta power, as well as looking at institutional structures to back that up. So I'm happy to share these community tensions in people's words, and what I've already mentioned, right? And this is recreating a scenario where people are, instead of us having an opportunity to, as members of the public, have some sort of collaboration or coalition building so that we can counter that industry meta power. There's a lot of divide and conquer going on. It's really brilliant, right? And from the industry perspective, where you have neighborhoods kind of warring with one another about who gets the well pads, right? Who gets this undesirable land use. And that not in my backyard behavior is really structured by the opportunities people have for participation, which is just that, or having the industry locate there and you have a memorandum of understanding with the industry, which says, okay, you're going to set up here, but we're going to have some terms that you agree to, which often are the community monitoring air and water themselves, right, is often the kind of outcome there. So the takeaway here is that institutional context really matters when we're looking at these systems of energy production as they intersect with food and water systems. These procedural inequities are really driven by institutional context, and they're related to people feeling uncertain and powerless about what role the public has in deciding how we use all these different resources and land. These are just some pictures that I took from Lighthawk is a really cool nonprofit that'll take you on low-level flights if you're working on like conservation issues. This was taken beyond a sound wall, so that's a sound wall right there. There are homes just across the street, and this is what's going on behind those. Just a sense of these mixed land uses and how interesting it is to have this going on right by farmland that is across the street. This was taken by one of my participants in my study. It's for a technique called photo voice, where folks take pictures of what's going on and giving narratives. This was taken from her roof. This is a sound wall that was put up by the Triple Creek site for about 15 feet from her bedroom window. It's about 25 feet tall. And so she went from being able to see all that for decades of the mountains and the big open fields to having a sound wall right outside of her home so trucks could drive by. This is an example of a produced water spill that was started in the well pads behind someone's house and ended up leaking into, and produced water is highly radioactive and briny and has all the 500 chemicals in it that we add to it to make the fluid more viscous and things like that. So just a sense, I'm going to highlight one other project that was funded by the CSU Water Center to really bring in water to this. And in this, I looked at how the heck this industry accesses water, fresh, potable water, right, that they've needed until very recently to do the hydraulic fracturing. How do they access that water in a state where water is so over allocated, over appropriated, and most of these operators would be junior water rights holders or have no water rights, right, given their place in line. So I was asking, how the heck do they get access to water in the state? Very much looking at this intersection between agricultural use of water and agricultural land, as well as demands from land from municipal sources. Everything's increasing, right? So how does oil and gas really fit into this? And I did multiple methods. That's what we typically do as sociologists. Want at least 3 methods that you're using to compare and triangulate your data. These included in-depth interviews with folks who are water providers who get water for the industry themselves, ditch company managers, farmers who are leasing or selling water, as well as a lot of ethnographic data collection, participant observation, going to farms, going to ditch companies. This is a picture of a ditch company over in Weld County. That was one of the major players in leasing water to the industry. And I'll just leave us with one key finding. This was just published in an article in Rural Sociology looking at the impact the industry is having on water market. I will say this is still mysterious. No one would really tell me what the heck is going on, which made me think that there's something really interesting going on. And it makes me want to really study this even more. But for example, the industry is probably using the wrong color water to frack. Like if they're leasing water from the agricultural industry and they're using that water for industrial purposes, that's technically not cool, according to our water court, right? And I was seeing a lot of evidence of that, but I couldn't really substantiate that was happening. what I could substantiate was that the water market in Colorado has been really impacted by the entrance of these oil and gas operators. What happens is if there's extra water in a year, you can lease your water, right? So you want to use your water or you'll lose it. So you want to lease it if you're not going to use it. And in years where we have abundant water, that goes on a lot in the state. And water markets help govern all of that. And what ends up happening quite predictably, right, is that when you have farmers who are participating in this water market who don't have water rights or have really junior water rights and they need to get access to water, they can pay about $50 to $100 an acre foot to lease that water. The industry could pay about $1,500 to $2,000 an acre foot at the beginning just to lease that water. So they've come into these markets, right? And while they might consume a small percentage of fresh water overall, the impact on markets has been substantial and has really affected people's, especially small agricultural operators, access to those water markets and the designation of water rights in the long term. They're also using water to extinction. So water that's used for hydraulic fracturing never re-enters the hydrologic cycle, right? It's contaminated. We're either re-injecting it or we're storing it in frac ponds, which is done less because it takes so much land and is so risky. So there are a variety of ways that water markets and the use of water are really being impacted. And this is just a representative quote that I'll leave us with from a conservancy district board member, a Colorado water market expert, showing just that discrepancy, right? That as he says, the oil and gas people can essentially set the market price to lease shares of water, and the price of rental water has gotten so high, especially in dry years, that only oil and gas companies can afford it. Farmers especially are priced right out. And so this is having enormous impacts, especially on small and medium-sized operators in the state of Colorado and elsewhere where we have similar systems of water rights and allocation set up. And it kind of remains to be seen what the actual outcome of this is, especially in dry years, because while we've been booming, we've had mostly free river or wetter years, not the kind of droughts that we saw here in like 2002, 2003. So I think then we'll see the competition getting really high. And there are a few other key findings that emerged, but we'll leave it at that. I want to leave us with this idea that all of these sectors that we're looking at are implicated in boom-bust dynamics, given that we have global capitalist market systems that these commodities are tied into. And so that's the kind of instability that, especially if we look at agricultural operators who are taking on agricultural commodity markets and natural gas or oil markets often, those safety nets, right, are not very reliable for the individual households or for the communities and counties that are staking a lot of their income on this industry. And I just wanted to leave us with that a little bit, as well as the idea of climate change being the other thing I haven't talked about here that's driving part of this divide, right? The concern over our carbon budget and not extracting more fossil fuels versus our state talking about investing in infrastructure for this kind of industry to continue developing. All right. I left us 5 minutes. Okay. I know some of the stuff might feel like out of left field, right? But yeah, I'm happy if there are any questions.
Yeah, it could be a naive question. So talking about the competition with agricultural land, particularly the water, did you find that the water, or maybe you didn't get a consensus or answer on this, but the water that is getting outpriced, is that ag water associated with the land? So because I know it can be very separated.
It is, and it depends on the water, right? So the Big Thompson Conservancy District has shares of water that are the most desirable because that's water that if you lease it, you can use it for anything.
And it doesn't have to enter the system.
Right. It's different though if as an operator, you're trying to approach farmers or ranchers more individually. There may be big land holders, right? Like Steve Wells, for example, has a bunch of wells on his land. It's like his name was just made it happen. And is getting so some big agricultural operators are making out like crazy, right? But typically what will happen is if the company is going, and each company has a different strategy, I did learn. Anadarko, for example, which is soon going to be bought by another oil and gas company, they prefer to strike up relationships with farmers and ranchers and lease their water and not have any ownership or any of their own rights, right? They position themselves as wanting to work with what's going on and with operators and be seen as allies, whereas companies like Noble, they want to actually buy the land, right? They want to buy and dry, essentially. So buy up the agricultural land, get those water rights with it, and be able to do whatever they'd like to, as well as possibly sink wells, which is outside of a bit the system of water rights. You have to augment the system a bit, but that's very complicated and I won't get into it. But there are ways in which different companies are using these strategies depending on whether they want to own that rights, right? You don't own the water, but you own the share, or if they want to use that as a strategic way to interact with the community more and pay farmers on a yearly basis, right? Which the advantage of that is they don't have to go to water court and it can take a very long time to buy that piece of land and get that water switched over to industrial use, or really all of the above is what they want. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Go ahead. So I guess, I don't know, I just like your approach and through how uncertainty causes a lot of stress, powerlessness also causes a lot of stress. I have a lot of family, sometimes up in Wyoming, and they have, developments all around, and then some of our conversations are just dominated by those same topics. And it's really just interesting how they're hearing from someone else, and it just sort of builds, and they're getting all this information, they're not really sure in it. It seems a lot to me kind of like problems that we encounter sometimes in agricultural extension. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are about, I don't know if you call it energy extension, but an approach where land-grant universities might be involved in education and outreach that centered around those topics.
That is a brilliant question, and you've read my mind in a lot of ways. So when I was at Brown doing my postdoc, I was doing research in Pennsylvania on oil and gas extraction there, like I mentioned, in those northern tier counties of Pennsylvania. And the interesting thing to me was that Penn State, which is also a land grant, right, their extension agents were invaluable, a little controlling, but also invaluable gatekeepers for bringing me into those communities and introducing new folks, because their extension office at Penn State had made it a priority to educate themselves on oil and gas and to really be proactive supporters, especially of farmers in Pennsylvania that were dealing with those overlapping land uses. So, for example, have workshops on how do you sign a lease? What does a lease mean, right? What are you signing away when you do this? So with some aspects of the process, there could be certainty, right? I mean, it was delayed. They didn't get out in front of it, but once they understood that need was there, they were on the ground and they were helping communities, and especially farmers and ranchers, as much as they could. That has been totally absent here, as far as I can see. I was shocked to get to Colorado State, has robust extension capacity, and no one is doing that for people who are working with the oil and gas industry. And to me, that helps create more uncertainty, right? Because you don't have you have to be able to afford a lawyer to even understand what's going on in your lease terms if you're lucky enough to sign a lease and get any benefits from this, right? So even when you have some power, it's limited, and our university extension is missing an opportunity, I think, to help support all of those communities and especially the agricultural actors who are trying to make these decisions but having very little support, especially if they can't afford, not just to have a lawyer look it over, but have the lawyer work with them for much longer to help rewrite those terms and have them not just be the boilerplate from the industry. So I think CSU could do a lot more, especially given that we do have folks working on energy, right? And there could be a way, but they're very focused on renewable energy rather than looking at what's really going on in these spaces of uncertainty that are just getting worse, I would say. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And I think the thing that I really can kind of take back on is just how little industry even is engaging with the community.
Yes.
And it feels like this is kind of just an area where industry can be able to get more access. It feels like they're all
right.
It feels like a good space.
Yeah. And that's been the most mysterious to me, is why wouldn't you at least try to create the illusion of goodwill?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's going to be a really nice apprenticeship opportunity for an interview student to help develop materials for extension and maybe hold some training workshops or something like that. Because I think our extension staff here would be thrilled to engage in activities like that, but likely don't have the materials. So maybe we can be thinking about ways we can mold that into a student project for what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Not their research, but maybe could be their practical experience opportunity.
Yeah.
I think people might want to leave.
Yeah,
I do have a question.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.